They would later say the base had never been meant to hear sirens in the night. It had been built with distance in mind, distance from the shifting front, from the thunder of artillery, from the ruin that marked so many other installations across the continent. Distance was its shield, and over time that shield hardened into certainty. The men stationed there felt it in the steady rhythm of their days, in the orderly columns of supply trucks rolling through the gates, in a predictable arc of patrol aircraft lifting into pale morning skies. The base stood on a stretch of high ground bordered by marshland and a narrow coastline, its runways carved out of reclaimed earth, its hangars aligned with geometric precision. From above, it looked less like a military outpost and more like a permanent fixture of the landscape, something that had always been there and would remain. Routine defined everything. Reveille broke the dawn in measured tones. Boots struck gravel in synchronized cadence, and the smell of fuel mingled with wet grass as ground crews moved toward their assigned aircraft. Mechanics worked with quiet familiarity, hands blackened by oil, checking control surfaces, inspecting engines, tightening bolts with practiced confidence. Pilots studied weather charts in the operations room, tracing projected wind currents with grease pencils, discussing patrol sectors in low, even voices. Their missions were often uneventful, long hours over empty water or forested terrain, watching for movement that rarely appeared. Reports were filed, signatures placed, and the day folded into the next without disruption. Commanders spoke often of geography as though it were an ally. The surrounding marshes limited approach by land. The coastline, patrolled and monitored, offered clear lines of sight. Enemy forces were concentrated far to the south, intelligence insisted, and their logistical reach was stretched thin. The base's strategic purpose was to support broader operations, not to serve as a frontline bastion. It was a hub, a reserve, a quiet anchor in a war defined elsewhere by chaos. That distinction created a psychological buffer. Men transferred in from active combat zones felt an immediate shift in atmosphere. The air seemed lighter here, the nights quieter. There were no distant flashes on the horizon, no rumbling tremors beneath the soil. Letters home describe stability rather than danger. Yet war has a way of eroding certainty in increments too small to notice at first. In the communications hut near the eastern perimeter, radio operators began logging transmissions that did not fit established patterns. Signals intercepted at odd hours, faint and fragmented, sometimes encoded bursts too brief to analyze fully. The intelligence officer reviewed them with a furrowed brow, but found no decisive correlation. Atmospheric interference, he suggested. Stray frequencies carried by unusual weather systems. He filed them alongside other anomalies, marked for further observation but not escalation. Reconnaissance patrols reported small inconsistencies along the coastline. Fishing vessels operating outside customary lanes. Lights spotted briefly offshore before disappearing into darkness. Each instance carried plausible explanation. Civilian error. Navigational miscalculation. The war had displaced communities, disrupted trade routes. Irregularity had become common everywhere. To interpret every deviation as hostile intent would have paralyzed operations. So judgment leaned toward restraint, toward preserving normalcy. Weather, too, began to complicate the picture. Early winter storms rolled in from the sea with increasing frequency, bringing dense fog that clung to the runways and reduced visibility to a narrow corridor of gray. Radar installations, still relatively new and not entirely trusted, produced intermittent echoes during heavy moisture. Technicians adjusted dials, recalibrated equipment, and noted the fluctuations in their logs. None of it amounted to a clear warning. It was simply inconvenience, the kind that demanded adaptation rather than alarm. Within the officers' quarters, conversations remained measured. Maps were unfolded across wooden tables. Supply allocations reviewed. Training schedules adjusted to accommodate shorter daylight hours. The commanding officer, a man shaped by earlier campaigns, valued order above all. He believed in preparedness, but he also believed in proportion. To overreact to incomplete information, he often reminded his staff, was to squander resources and morale. The base functioned smoothly because its men trusted the steadiness of command. That trust was not easily disturbed. For the enlisted personnel, life settled into a rhythm that bordered on domestic. Evenings were spent in the mess hall beneath dim lights, tin cups warming cold hands, conversations drifting between speculation about the broader war and memories of home. Some read newspapers weeks out of date, tracing headlines about offensives and political speeches. Others wrote letters, careful not to reveal operational details, but eager to reassure families that they were safe. Safety was a word that appeared most often, though it was rarely examined too closely. Still, beneath the surface, a subtle tension threaded through daily routines. Anti-aircraft crews found their drills reviewed with slightly greater frequency. Ammunition inventories were checked twice instead of once. Fuel reserves were redistributed across storage points rather than concentrated in a single depot. These adjustments were framed as efficiency measures, practical refinements in response to evolving wartime doctrine. No announcement declared an increased threat level. There was no need to unsettle the garrison with hypotheticals. The base hospital staff quietly restocked medical supplies beyond standard allotments. Engineers reinforced sections of the perimeter fencing that had weathered poorly in recent storms. None of these actions, taken individually, signaled imminent danger. Collectively, however, they reflected an unspoken recognition that distance alone could not guarantee immunity. The war was dynamic, adaptive, relentless in its search for vulnerability. On clear nights, sentries posted along the outer boundary listened to the wind move through marsh reeds and watched the horizon dissolve into darkness. The sky above remained vast and indifferent, stars scattered across its expanse as they had been long before the conflict began. The men on watch sometimes felt suspended between worlds, removed from the violence that consumed other regions, yet undeniably connected to it. Their rifles rested against shoulders stiffened by cold, their breath rising in pale clouds. Confidence still held. The base continued to function with disciplined precision, its runways busy, its command structure intact. But the foundation of that confidence had shifted. It was no longer rooted solely in geography or reputation. It rested increasingly on assumption, on the belief that patterns observed in the past would persist unchanged. In the quiet accumulation of minor irregularities, unanswered signals, unexplained sightings, whether that obscured more than it revealed, the base's sense of permanence began to thin, almost imperceptibly, like ice under steady pressure. Winter settled over the base with a weight that felt heavier than snow alone. The marshland stiffened under frost, reeds bending into brittle arcs that cracked under a boot's careless step. The sea beyond the coastline darkened to a dull steel gray, its surface broken by wind that carried a sharper edge than in months past. Operations continued as scheduled, but the tempo shifted in subtle ways that only those closest to the machinery of the base truly sensed. There were no announcements, no alarms, no official changes in posture. Yet something in the daily rhythm had tightened, as if an unseen hand had drawn the threads of routine a little closer together. Inside the radar station, a low concrete structure half buried against the cold, technicians leaned over glowing scopes that cast pale green light across their faces. The equipment hummed with steady electricity, vacuum tubes warming the cramped room with faint heat. Most returns were predictable arcs, known flight paths plotted with methodical accuracy. But increasingly, there were flickers at the edge of range, brief contacts that appeared and vanished before a second sweep could confirm them. Operators adjusted gain controls, tapped the glass screens lightly, recalibrated frequencies. Moisture in the atmosphere could distort signals. Temperature inversions sometimes bent waves in unexpected directions. The official explanation remained atmospheric interference, and it satisfied procedure, if not instinct. Logs recorded each anomaly with disciplined precision. Time, bearing, estimated range, duration. The pages began to show a pattern not obvious in isolation, but faintly suggestive when viewed across weeks. The intelligence officer reviewed the entries during evening briefings, his finger tracing columns of figures. He asked measured questions, never accusatory, always analytical. Could migrating flocks account for certain signatures? Were friendly patrols fully synchronized with radar schedules? The technicians answered carefully, aware that speculation carried weight. None wished to appear alarmist. The war had taught them that false certainty could be as dangerous as ignorance. One afternoon, a coastal patrol aircraft failed to return at its expected hour. The runway lights remained unlit, waiting in quiet anticipation as mechanics lingered by tool carts, glancing toward the horizon. Radio operators sent repeated call signs into static. Their voices steadied despite the growing silence that followed each transmission. When the aircraft finally responded, the signal was faint but intelligible. A mechanical issue, the pilot reported, compounded by deteriorating weather conditions. He would divert to an alternate field inland. The explanation was plausible, even routine, yet left behind a residue of unease. The delay had been minor, the solution orderly. But for those who had stood in the cold, scanning empty sky, the gap had felt longer than the clock suggested. Senior officers gathered that evening in the operations room, where maps covered the walls in overlapping layers. Colored pins marked patrol sectors, supply routes, reported sightings. The commanding officer listened as intelligence summaries were delivered in restrained tones. Enemy movements remained concentrated far from their position. No confirmed offensives threatened their region. Logistics networks showed no disruption. The evidence did not justify raising alert levels. And yet, as contingency drills were quietly reviewed and defense protocols re-examined, the room carried an undercurrent of caution that required no formal declaration. Anti-aircraft crews noticed their rotations lengthen. Shifts that once ended at midnight extended into the early hours before dawn. Gun barrels were cleaned more frequently, breech mechanisms inspected with deliberate care. The metallic scent of lubricant mixed with the cold air as crews practiced tracking exercises against imaginary targets sweeping across the darkened sky. Floodlights were tested and retested, their beams cutting through drifting snow and harsh white columns. The men joked about chasing ghosts, but their laughter felt thinner, less assured. Fuel storage procedures changed as well. Where once reserves had been centralized for efficiency, tankers now distributed supplies across multiple depots, each carefully camouflaged and shielded with sandbags. Engineers calculated blast radii, measuring distances with surveying tools that sank into frozen ground. These decisions were framed as prudent modernization, aligning with updated wartime doctrine. No communique linked them to any specific threat. Still, the dispersion required additional manpower and coordination, an acknowledgement that concentration carried risk. In the barracks, conversations shifted in tone though not in subject. Newspapers continued to circulate, their pages creased and smudged by many hands. Men debated distant battles, tracing troop movements with fingers stained by ink. Yet, when the wind rattled window panes at night, some lay awake longer than before, listening for sounds beyond the ordinary. The base remained outwardly calm, but the margin between normal and abnormal had narrowed. Weather compounded the tension. Storm fronts rolled in from the sea with increasing unpredictability, reducing visibility to mere yards. Radar interference grew more frequent during these conditions, the screens alive with indistinct returns that forced operators to rely on judgment rather than clarity. Pilots preparing for patrol flights studied meteorological reports with heightened scrutiny, aware that low cloud ceilings and icy crosswinds could transform routine missions into hazardous undertakings. Ground crews worked with numbed fingers, tightening fastenings that resisted under cold metal contraction. The hospital staff conducted inventory checks that extended late into the evening. Crates of medical supplies were opened, counted, resealed. Bandages, morphine ampoules, plasma units. The chief medic offered no explanation for the additional audits beyond thoroughness, yet his assistants understood that preparation carried its own language. Engineers reinforced sections of perimeter fencing weakened by frost heave, driving posts deeper into soil hardened like stone. Searchlight towers received structural inspections. Boats tightened against winter gales. Through it all, leadership maintained composure. Orders were delivered in steady cadence. Meetings concluded with clear directives. Panic was never allowed to take root. The base's identity depended on discipline, on the belief that rational assessment would prevail over rumor. But beneath that composed exterior lay an unspoken acknowledgement that the war's geography could shift without notice. Distance did not guarantee immunity. It merely delayed confrontation. As December advanced, the cumulative effect of these adjustments became impossible to ignore for those who watched closely. The base had not declared itself under threat, yet it moved as though preparing for a possibility it refused to name. Each precaution was reasonable, each explanation defensible. Taken together, they formed a quiet transformation. The illusion of complete insulation had faded, replaced by a vigilance that settled into bones and routines alike. Winter had brought more than cold. It had introduced a new awareness, subtle but persistent, that the darkness beyond perimeter might hold more than weather and wandering echoes. Midnight arrived without ceremony, marked only by the changing of the watch and the distant churn of surf against a frozen shoreline. The base lay under a brittle sky, stars sharp and innumerable above the darkened marsh. Frost silvered the runways and clung to the wings of parked aircraft, their silhouettes motionless beneath hooded lamps. In the barracks, most men slept in heavy wool blankets, boots lined neatly beneath bunks, rifles stacked in ordered racks. A few remained awake on duty, radio operators tracing steady signals across headphones, sentries pacing measured routes along the perimeter fence, anti-aircraft crews hunched in thick coats beside silent guns. The air felt suspended, as though even the wind had withdrawn. The first explosion tore that stillness apart with a violence that seemed to lift the ground itself. It struck near the outer fuel depot, a concussive flash that turned night briefly into white daylight. Windows shattered inward across administrative buildings, glass scattering over desks and concrete floors. A heartbeat later, a second detonation rippled through the eastern perimeter, followed by the rising wail of sirens that had not been heard in earnest before. Their mechanical howl cut through sleep and disbelief alike, dragging men upright before thought to catch up to instinct. In the communications hut, headsets slipped from ears as operators lunged for switches, voices overlapping in urgent fragments. Lines that had carried routine traffic moments earlier now crackled under sudden overload. Reports collided with requests for confirmation. Coordinates shouted over static. Outside, floodlights snapped on, beams slicing through drifting smoke that already began to thicken along the ground. Within that haze, shapes moved too fast and too low to identify clearly, engines rumbling with unfamiliar cadence. Another explosion struck closer to hangars, its shockwave rattling metal doors and sending tools clattering from benches. Flames leapt upward, feeding hungrily on aviation fuel stored for morning patrols. The fire's heat pressed outward in waves, thawing frost in seconds and igniting canvas covers draped over nearby equipment. Mechanics who had slept only minutes before now sprinted across open ground, some half-dressed, others fastening helmets as they ran. Training overrode confusion. Each man moved toward his assigned station, as though guided by invisible lines drawn long ago. Anti-aircraft batteries swung into motion with grinding urgency. Crews spun elevation wheels, scanning the sky for targets that darted beyond the edges of light. The first burst of defensive fire cracked upward, tracers carving brief orange paths through darkness. Spent casings spilled onto frozen earth, steaming faintly in the cold. The gunners' faces were set in rigid concentration, eyes straining against smoke and glare. Orders were relayed in clipped phrases, distances estimated, bearings adjusted by instinct and fragmentary radar guidance. Near the command building, officers gathered under a canopy of sparks drifting from a damaged roof. Maps were unrolled across a table already dusted with broken plaster. Runners carried updates between stations, boots pounding across gravel now littered with debris. The commanding officer's voice remained steady, though his coat smoldered at one sleeve where embers had landed unnoticed. He redirected fire teams toward the fuel dispersal points, recognizing the pattern emerging through chaos. The attack was not random. It sought paralysis, striking infrastructure before response could solidify. A third wave of explosions targeted the main communications mast. Steel supports buckled under the blast, cables snapping like taut wire under strain. For a moment, external contact faltered entirely, leaving the base isolated within its own roaring perimeter. In the hospital wing, orderlies steadied stretchers as wounded were carried in, faces streaked with soot and blood. The sharp scent of antiseptic fought against a heavier odor of smoke that infiltrated every corridor. Aircraft parked along the western runway were caught in the open. Some crews attempted desperate measures, dragging hoses toward encroaching flames, while others focused on clearing ammunition stores before secondary detonations could claim more lives. One hangar door, jammed by twisted metal, required 3 men to force aside, their gloves burning as they heaved against searing steel. Inside, an engine test stand had toppled, crushing crates of spare parts beneath its weight. Through the turmoil, Certain details etched themselves into memory with unnatural clarity. The crunch of frost giving way beneath hurried steps. The metallic tang of cordite hanging low over the field. The way searchlights illuminated snowflakes drifting through rising smoke, transforming them into sparks that seemed to fall upward rather than down. Time fractured into moments measured by impact and response rather than minutes. Gradually, coordination began to take hold. Radar operators, working with partial systems, identified approach vectors with greater confidence. Anti-aircraft fire tightened into disciplined arcs rather than scattered bursts. Damage control teams established containment lines around the largest blazes, isolating fuel sources before they could ignite in succession. The attackers' precision remained evident in the pattern of destruction, but the defenders' training asserted itself through repetition and resolve. As the final detonations faded into distant reverberations, the night settled into a new, harsher stillness. Flames continued to burn in controlled sections, casting an orange glow over twisted silhouettes of aircraft and shattered windows. Sirens wound down gradually, replaced by shouted instructions and the steady hiss of extinguishers. The base no longer resembled the ordered installation it had been hours before. Runways were scarred with craters. Storage depots reduced to skeletal frames, and the once confident symmetry of structures lay broken by blast and fire. Men stood amid smoke and drifting ash, their breaths visible in cold air now thick with the residue of combustion. Some stared in disbelief at the altered landscape. Others moved automatically, assisting the wounded or clearing debris from pathways. The cost of earlier certainty had materialized in wreckage and loss, tangible and irreversible. What had been considered distant and improbable had arrived without restraint, transforming familiar ground into contested space. In those hours before dawn, the base ceased to be a symbol of security and became instead a testament to vulnerability revealed under sudden light. Dawn came slowly, reluctant to reveal what the night had done. A pale gray light crept across the marsh and settled over the base, softening nothing, forgiving nothing. Smoke still drifted upward from blackened craters along the perimeter, curling into the cold morning air as if the ground itself were exhaling. Frost had returned in delicate patterns over twisted metal, tracing fragile beauty across wreckage that hours earlier had burned with violent intensity. In the growing light, the full scale of destruction emerged without distortion. Aircraft lay scattered across the runways at unnatural angles, wings torn open. Fuselages split to expose ribs of aluminum and wiring. One bomber had been flipped onto its side, its propellers bent like broken fingers pressed into the tarmac. Another rested intact but gutted by fire. Cockpit glass melted into opaque waves. Ground crews moved among them in silence, boots crunching over debris that had once been essential components. The familiar geometry of the airfield had been disrupted. Craters interrupted taxi lines, and blast marks radiated outward in dark halos. Near the Easton Fuel Depot, little remained beyond charred frameworks and pools of hardened residue. Engineers stood with clipboards, calculating losses in measured tones that masked exhaustion. They spoke of gallons destroyed, of storage capacity reduced by percentages that would echo through supply schedules for weeks. Logistics officers traced revised routes on updated maps, already planning for emergency deliveries from inland reserves. The efficiency that had defined the base before the attack did not vanish. It reassembled itself under strain, driven now by necessity rather than routine. Casualty stations operated with grim focus. Stretchers lined corridors where wounded men lay wrapped in blankets, faces pale against soot-streaked skin. Medics moved from one to another, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, administering morphine with careful restraint. Outside, a row of blankets covered those who would not rise again. Chaplains walked slowly between them, offering quiet words that carried no theatricality, only acknowledgement. The emotional weight settled heavily across the compound, not as hysteria, but as a steady pressure behind the eyes of those who bore witness. In the command building, windows boarded hastily against the cold, officers gathered around a scarred table. Maps were replaced with fresh copies, though the room still smelled faintly of smoke. Reports were delivered in sequence, confirmed losses, damaged infrastructure, remaining operational assets. The commanding officer listened without interruption, his expression fixed in controlled contemplation. When he spoke, his voice carried neither anger nor despair, only recognition that assumptions held before midnight could no longer stand. Investigators began assembling fragments of information that had once seemed disconnected. Radar logs were spread across desks, pages compared side by side to identify recurring bearings and intervals. Intercepted transmissions, previously dismissed as atmospheric distortion, were re-examined with sharpened scrutiny. Patterns emerged gradually, like outlines developing in a photograph. The fleeting contacts had aligned with storm fronts that masked approach. The irregular coastal sightings corresponded with shifts in maritime traffic that now appeared less accidental. What had been isolated anomalies formed a chain when viewed without the filter of complacency. Senior intelligence officers debated these findings with disciplined candor. No single report had justified alarm on its own. Each had been plausible, defensible, yet together they revealed a vulnerability not in equipment or manpower, but in interpretation. The base had relied on probability, on the belief that its location rendered it strategically unattractive. That belief had shaped responses to ambiguity, steering decisions toward caution rather than escalation. In the aftermath, that posture felt insufficient. Across the airfield, salvage operations commenced with methodical persistence. Cranes were brought forward to clear debris from runways, their cables straining against warped fuselages. Engineers filled craters with gravel and tamped it down under the weight of heavy rollers. Anti-aircraft crews inspected barrels scarred by rapid fire, replacing components worn by the sudden intensity of engagement. The rhythm of labor carried its own kind of healing. Movement replaced shock, structure replaced chaos. Letters began to be written again, though their tone had shifted. Men described the attack in restrained language, omitting details that might alarm families, but unable to conceal entirely the transformation they had witnessed. They wrote of resilience, of comradeship under fire, of rebuilding efforts already underway. Beneath those reassurances lay an unspoken acknowledgement that their sense of invulnerability had dissolved. The base was no longer a sanctuary removed from conflict. It had become part of the front in every meaningful sense. Strategic directives from higher command arrived by afternoon, carried through restored communication channels. Reinforcements would be dispatched, defensive systems upgraded, radar coverage expanded. Recommendations included decentralizing command nodes and hardening infrastructure against future strikes. These measures did not erase what had occurred, but they signaled adaptation. Doctrine evolved in response to experience, shaped not by theory alone, but by the scars etched into concrete and memory. As the sun climbed higher, the last visible flames were extinguished. Smoke thinned into faint wisps that drifted toward the sea. The base remained wounded but operational, its personnel moving with a renewed clarity born of confrontation. What had once been considered untouchable now stood as evidence that distance does not confer immunity. The lessons drawn from that night would ripple outward, informing planning far beyond the marsh and coastline that had seemed so secure. By evening, generators hummed steadily, lights restored across much of the compound. The silhouettes of damaged aircraft still punctuated the horizon, reminders of cost and consequence. Yet alongside them stood men who had endured the rupture of certainty and responded not with collapse, but with resolve. The base would rebuild, its routines altered, its vigilance sharpened. Its story would persist as a measured testament to the danger of unexamined confidence and the enduring capacity of disciplined adaptation in the face of sudden war.